I'm Howard Reich. I'm the author of 6 books, including Let Freedom Swing, Portraits in Jazz, and Jelly's Blues, which is a biography of Jelly Roll Morton. I'm also the producer, writer of 3 documentary films, and I was the Chicago Tribune's jazz critic for the past 32 years and covered music for the Tribune for 43 years until January, this past January, when I just finally retired from the newspaper, but not from writing. And I'm here with a very distinguished and much admired jazz musician, John Clayton, and I can't do justice to his biography. So John, would you just tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Oh, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, Howard. I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm actually back here now, and I started school here. I studied with Ray Brown at a class that he taught, the great bass player here in Los Angeles, when I was a teenager. And from that course, I developed a close relationship with him. I finished school at Indiana University, where I met Jeff Hamilton. After graduating from IU, I uh, combined forces with Jeff and Monty Alexander, and we toured for 2 years, recorded, etc. And I joined uh, Count Basie Orchestra for another 2 years, and then I moved to Holland, where I was the principal bass player in the Amsterdam Philharmonic for 5 years. Then I moved to Los Angeles. By then, I was married and had 2 children, and moved to LA and started the Clayton Hamilton Jazz Orchestra, and that band still exists. It's been in existence since 1985, um, and also until recently, from that time until recently, really worked on the Clayton Brothers group. My brother Jeff just died recently, so that group won't exist anymore. But I'm still quite busy and doing a lot of teaching. I taught at USC here in California for about 21 years, and I continue to do workshops and some private lessons. So
Uh,
try to keep myself busy, like as do you, which
that's
doesn't
a
sound a problem, like a problem for you. My
no,
goodness.
but that's a hell of a resume you have. So it's often said that jazz is the music of freedom, and I want to ask you if you agree with that concept, and if so, why is that?
Yes, because jazz involves improvisation. Without that element, that key improvisational element, there won't be jazz. So therein lies the expressive, the artistic freedom. Um, but it's freedom of it's framed in the subject of expression, right? So it's a tool of expression. Music is a tool of expression. And in that we have this tool, it really is about expressing yourself, expressing your feelings. If you want to add other things to that, it's up to the performer. But primarily, you make those sounds on your instrument, or you sing or whatever, because you feel a certain way about a sound and a feeling. And it's a beautiful tool of expression.
Do you think jazz also, in the use of the word freedom, represents the freedom of a people, the people who created this music?
Absolutely. Because and that's often, for the most part, it's an unconscious effort, because without realizing it, that high school student or that college performer is standing on the shoulders of this expression, which came from people who really used it, consciously used it, whether it was a work song on a chain gang, whether it was whatever. It's You've got a history there that you are embracing, whether you realize it or not. And I think that once they do realize it, and that comes with a few things, the teacher, your environment, your age, all of those things inform that. But once you realize those shoulders that you're standing on, I think it deepens the expression. It makes it even more meaningful to the performer.
And think too that when we think of jazz, the emergence of jazz, what we now call jazz, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, primarily in the South and in and around New Orleans, that is a period of great legalized oppression, oppression of a people. And I think it's possible to view jazz as a response to that oppression and a transcendence of that oppression. What do you think about that?
Oh, without a doubt. I totally agree with that. Again, I think that there are elements in music that are there that you don't realize, that you can't verbalize, and those things go away. And I think that what you just outlined are some of those elements. Um, when I lived in Holland, uh, so many good musicians there, just crazy good musicians, and um, but we were on European soil. They had their history and their background, um, and they played great jazz. The ones that were jazz players still play great jazz. Uh, However, when I was there, if I was to say to a musician or musicians that I'm playing with in Holland, "Hey guys, this next tune, it's got to be really greasy. You got to think about, some serious ribs and barbecue, some collard greens, and some
Yeah,
cornbread, and maybe a portion of black-eyed peas cooked in ham hock. That's the vibe." Now, if I tell that to you, you
yeah,
can smell that,
yeah, right.
you know. But if I tell somebody that those are the elements of the music and that lives and comes from Holland,
Yeah,
they might be able to relate to the sounds and maybe even the concept, but they won't be able to smell it.
yeah,
And that's no fault of theirs. It's just that they aren't able to latch on to those historical elements the way other people are that are a part of that soil. And I think that's the situation here, with regards um, the background, the history of the music, the oppression that goes along with it. If I know what it feels like uh, to witness police brutality. I know what it feels like to have somebody call me nigga. I know what it feels. I know all those things. And somebody from another kind of environment background is not. And I think that that bleeds into the music. That's my main point. Those things actually are a part of the music.
So there's no separating the music from the social history in which it came about. And that goes from the late 1800s to today. You can't separate one from another, I think is what you're saying.
Yes, exactly. You can't separate them. And even if you are involved in it and you don't truly know a good portion of that history, uh, it's still there.
Yeah.
You cannot, like you said, you can't separate it. It's still there.
So this leads to a fascinating irony, which is why is it that Europe and elsewhere in the world for a long time has appreciated this music in many cases more than the United States? And think of all the great jazz musicians who went to live in Paris, Johnny Griffin and Sidney Bechet, and felt they were getting a degree of respect there that they were not getting in their own country. How do you interpret that strange situation?
Oh gosh, that's many faceted. Excuse me. From the standpoint of the listener, um, the grass is always greener, and here is this new music, newer to them because it had to travel over at least one continent before it reached them. So they weren't a part of and vice versa. I mean, the same thing. There's there are sounds from listening to uh, a Maori musician playing the didgeridoo is fascinating to us because we've never heard that sound. And how about even the sounds of composers like Beethoven, those sorts of things didn't happen here. Therefore, it's almost as if, wow, that's amazing,
Yeah.
fascinating. Okay,
Yeah.
so all that to say that I think that those elements also factored into the reason why our music, our jazz music created here, was so interesting to Europeans, and the fact that this music, like all music, was melding the European sounds that they were familiar with this new thing, this new way of improv. I mean, improvisation is not new, but
Right.
improvising in the way that we did it as we created jazz was totally new to them.
Yeah.
So here's this brand new package that they open up, and out comes this new sound that draws them. And then so I think that those are some of the sort of the knee-jerk beginnings and
Yeah.
reactions to
Yeah.
the music when Europeans first heard it, when it was first delivered to them, I imagine, which of course represents their curiosity, leading to their hunger for more, making them really applaud and accept it and bring it into their world. So when a musician, um, like a Johnny Griffin or Sydney or the List,
Yeah.
Dexter Gordon, all the rest,
Yeah.
when they go there and see all of this beautiful acceptance of them and their music, they think, what a great environment. And the next
Yeah.
thing you know,
Yeah.
they're falling in love with a woman and moving
Yeah.
there, which
Right.
sounds like an autobiography for me. It's exactly what I did. Um,
Yeah.
so I do see that. I think that Europeans were, it's easy, not easier, but they fell in love with our music because it was new to them, and I'm sure they had some kind of affinity, empathy for this improvisation thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm sure of that because I saw it with my own eyes.
And these musicians we talked about, and I perhaps too yourself, have been treated a different way in Europe than they were treated in the United States. They could be treated like human beings.
That's true. Absolutely, absolutely true. You didn't have to. I mean, I remember moving to Holland and seeing and feeling all these things that I'd never experienced here in the States. Things like being in a country where there were no poor people.
Hmm.
Wrap your head around that.
Yeah.
You grow up in the U.S. and I grew up poor. We weren't starving, but
Yeah.
you know, it was not easy. My mom would say in the morning as a kid, to me, listen, uh, go to your Aunt Bernice's and borrow 6 slices of bread
Yeah.
so that I can make you guys lunch. I mean, that
Yeah.
that sort of thing
Yeah.
unheard of in a place like Holland.
Yeah.
Um, by the way, if I can interject
Yeah.
here, when I hear people talk about how they are totally against the idea of socialism, I kind of have to bite my tongue because I go, socialism? I lived in under socialism for 5 years, and I never had to worry about medical stuff, about health care. There were no poor people. For the first time in my life, I never had to. I actually got paid for a vacation as a
Yeah.
jazz musician.
Yeah.
I, um,
Sounds
okay,
terrible.
it's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
The way they do socialism seems to work pretty good to me. Anyway, yes, it was definitely and don't get me wrong, I love the United States. I
Yeah.
love America. I love being here. I'm so happy that I am who I am. But I do see the plus and minuses of other cultures,
Yeah.
of other countries,
Yeah.
and I think that um, that the I think that those surroundings, that environment, made it easier for me to breathe easy. it made it easier for me to realize that, you know what, I kind of don't have to worry about being pulled over by a policeman and having my hands on the steering wheel at 10 to 2 and making sure I, go through all that stuff that every woke black citizen here in the U.S. has to go through.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was kind of that part. There were certain things that were definitely
Yeah.
breaths of fresh air.
Jazz also, it seems to me, parallels and intertwines with the civil rights movement in the mid 20th century. Jazz was there commenting on it and being a part of it. What are your reflections and memories and feelings about the relationship between jazz and the civil rights movement?
They go hand in hand, as um, as do other aspects of art. If you look at visual art that was being created then, if you look at just any kind of any any kind of arena in the arts world, it's always something that people can grasp and use as a tool of expression for whatever it is they want to express. So I remember not only jazz, by the way, I remember um, the music in my church. My mom kept us in the church. We were there every Sunday at the Baptist church, and a very um, typical African American upbringing regarding that. But even in the music there, um, it was a tool of expression. There was a portion of the service which actually began before the larger morning service that was conducted by the deacons and a few members that were in attendance before the big service. Uh, and they would have this thing called a devotional. In that devotional, um, the deacon, anybody could lead it. It was often led by a deacon. The deacon would use this meter hymn to basically get off of their chest whatever it was they were going through. So they'd say, um, you know, I know it was a hard week this week. I went through so much strife, dealing with all these police folks and everybody else. Lord, hear my cry.
Yeah.
And then when he would go into that, everybody would chime in,
Yeah.
singing that, and then it would go back to whoever it was to go with more expression. It could be
Yeah.
some scripture from the Bible. It could just be talking about their hardships. It could be, so all that to say, it was not just jazz. It was art. It was music. It was in the church. But it was this beautiful vehicle for us to express what was going on in the world, in our lives at that moment. So when you go home after having had a meeting, um, a civil rights meeting in your town, and you're a musician, the next thing you know, you're sitting down and you're writing a song about it.
Mm.
So yeah, it's definitely a lock arms situation with everything that's going on in your life, including the civil rights movement at that time.
Yeah.
It's still that way.
Well, are there some works you think of as kind of embodying this call for freedom? I mean, I think of "We Insist, Freedom Now, Sweet" for Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln, Nina Simone, all those songs she sang, Mississippi Goddamn, and so on. Are there works that for you sort of embody jazz as speaking out, crying out for freedom?
I think of artists as much as I think of um, the pieces they're playing. Cannonball Adderley,
Yeah,
uh, Country Preacher. I think of Roland Kirk. I
yeah,
think of John Coltrane. I mean, there's Sonny Rollins.
yeah,
Um, I really think of artists. Oddly enough, it's an interesting question because
yeah,
I haven't thought of that, but I think when I think about the civil rights movement, immediately I kind of scrolled through a bunch of people in my mind that really represented um, needing to express what was going on with the movement, more so than pieces. I never thought about that.
But in all the artists you named, um, their music, especially when they're dealing with this subject, just has such a ferocity of expression. Sonny Rollins, Freedom Now, Sweden. There's just and everyone you mentioned, there's just you can read between the lines. You can hear what they're saying on this subject, even though it's without words.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that there was room for all artists. So a lot of the white artists that felt the brotherhood um, to the suffering and um, exploitation and segregation and all the things that we were fighting for at that time, they found ways of embracing that message as well. Whether it was Dave Brubeck,
Right.
whether it was somebody like Duke Ellington. There's an interesting example. Duke Ellington, who chose not to talk about the subject matter as much, but to be there in the fight, delivering his expression and giving his 2 cents, as it were, to the entire environment. And that meant for someone like Duke and Basie, that meant um, bringing a the music and the love elements that go along as a sort of glue, a binding effort in that way. Louis Armstrong, another example. Do you remember? I know you do. That he had the hit, kind of a mini hit, "What a Wonderful World,"
Yeah, sure.
and it coming out during that period. You probably know this.
Yeah.
Um, it coming out during that period, he got so much criticism because it's the lyrics are
Yeah.
just sort of flowery and
Yeah.
singing about what a wonderful world, and he was actually called an Uncle Tom, a traitor to his people, because of that song and the popularity of that song in the 60s, when there was all the protests and rioting going on. And he came out with a second version that allowed him a rebuttal. That it was the same song arranged by Oliver Nelson with beautiful strings, and he used the introduction to it to say, "Some of you folks been saying, Pops, what do you mean? What a wonderful world? What about hunger and pollution and all these wars?" And his take on it was, "All I'm trying to say is it would be a wonderful world if we would just love one another. Love, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the ticket,"
Mhm. Yeah.
and I thought it was a beautiful way for him to help people understand that he was a part of this too, but this is how he chose to deal with it, which was always so fascinating to me. You look at people like Milt Hinton,
Yeah.
Chicago's own,
Yeah.
Milt Hinton, who did the same thing, and there were quite a few musicians that were a part of it, but they just chose to express um, their contribution to the situation in a different way.
And even before that, Louis Armstrong recording Black and Blue. Why am I so black and blue? He sings,
Exactly
and that's
right.
almost like an anthem for the really confronting the situation. And also think of how ahead of the curve, now that you mentioned, Duke Ellington was, because in 1943 he made the premiere of Black, Brown, and Beige. Black,
Yeah, yeah,
Brown, and
yeah.
Beige. He's just saying it. He's just
Yep,
saying it.
yep, yep, yep. And he was always aware of the black elements of the music, you know, always. You could hear it, they called it, they had the jungle band period, amazing words like black and tan fantasy,
Yeah.
using uh, black in a way so
Right,
early on that
right,
other people wouldn't even touch.
right.
So yeah, you're right. He was uber ahead of his time.
So today, of course, we're in the midst of this global Black Lives Matter movement, which so many people have supported. Um, how has that affected you as a person and as a musician and your music? How do you process and turn that into art if you do?
Uh, well, I have I continue to write songs and works that reflect that consciously. Um, and just, there'll be, but I've done that. I've always done that. I continue to, I remember um, when the former administration was in the White House, that was just, for me, it was such a personal affront to all of the things that I held dear in terms of fairness and dignity, and so I ended up, expressing that in my music, whether it was a tune or a large work, um, and then that just sort of segued to um, this last summer where there were so many protests about again headed up by organizations like Black Lives Matter and Movement for Black Lives. Um, my daughter is also a major activist in that world. She's one of the authors of the Breathe Act. So I'm
Wow.
always having these discussions and always realizing what's going on or trying to stay up on what's going on. And it ends up being a part of my music, kind of whether I like it or not. But I do like it. I embrace it. I won't sit down, you know, with frustration and being really mad, pissed off at a situation, and then write a song that reflects that.
Yeah.
That's kind of not my style of doing things, but I will. It depends on how I feel, I guess. Sometimes I'll feel like writing something more, excuse me, more introverted and more sad and melancholy that will reflect that, how that has affected me personally. So sometimes I'll write things that really reflect what that's about. Other times I'll write music as a result of having been affected by those things going on. So it's kind of a combination of things.
So do you think jazz musicians are positioned to be able to convey a message of peace and hope and love, like you said with Louis Armstrong, that you guys are on stage and we listen to you and we hear you. What is it that you all can do for us and for the world at this time?
I do think, of course, I think that's um, possible, and I think it's necessary for the people that want to use music to express themselves in that way, because it has to be honest. And if you honestly don't want to use your music to express that at this moment, I don't want it to be forced. I want the honesty of expression. And I always tell my students that our goal for expressing ourselves through music is to express ourselves with honesty and clarity. The honesty we get, it's got to be real, it's got to be from you. What's the
Yeah,
clarity? The clarity is when I'm working on all those technical aspects of the music. Maybe I'm rushing the tempo, or I'm dragging the tempo, or the sound isn't quite in tune, or I don't really know the melody, or I'm playing A naturals on F minor chords, or whatever it is. All those things that I'm struggling with, the audience has to listen through my struggles before they get to my meaning, my expression. Therefore, we're in the practice room. We're working on the clarity of our expression. So it's always about honesty and clarity. So I think that when I hear people perform, I want honest expression. If your honest expression, it finds you, you know, with your hand, your fists clenched, and you're screaming, and you are so mad and so frustrated. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
If you're feeling that, bring it on.
Yeah.
You know, it's just got to be real.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to ask you is this year is the centennial of Dr. Billy Taylor, who, in addition to being such a wonderful, marvelous, fluid, virtuoso pianist, also was such a champion and advocate for this music in so many arenas where it wasn't always welcome. So if you tell us just your reflections on Dr. Billy Taylor and what he meant to music and to jazz.
Sheesh. You just pushed a button in me. And when you said Billy Taylor, it thrust me back to my very real experiences with him and knowing him and listening to him talk and having conversations with him that were always so uplifting, so deep, so um, important. Billy Taylor was one of the um, most important mouthpieces that we had of this music because he had that beautiful ability to, like Louis Armstrong, like Ellington, like Basie, like that list of people who were comfortable in many arenas. So he could um, he could offer up his very important points and understanding of the music and delivery of the music, not only to the very uh, involved, deep, heavy jazz musician, but to that person who knew nothing about jazz. And he could talk to them, he could play for them, and it would just he was like a Pied Piper. You know, you heard him play, you heard him talk, and you were there. You were in for the duration. So Billy Taylor, um, boy, and what a supportive soul he was. He was always, you know, he talked to me about what he enjoyed about me and enjoyed about my playing. This was in the beginning when I first met him, and then he ended up doing the same thing with my son Gerald. You know, telling me what he enjoyed about Gerald. So, what a positive resource for jazz Billy Taylor was. Now, I mean, I could just wax on about him forever because you really touched something in me. I haven't heard his name enough lately, and I think we need to.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, is a beautiful note on which to end this conversation. It's just been such an honor for me to speak to you one-on-one this way. And thank you for your generosity of thought and spirit through all of this.
Thank you, Howard. Thanks for all that you do to uplift this music too and keep it going. Appreciate
Thank
that.
you.